Welcome to Scary Folktales USA. Before we begin our journey into the shadows of the old line state, please heed this warning. The following story contains depictions of paranormal events, psychological tension, and supernatural occurrences. It is intended for fans of folklore and ghost stories. Viewer discretion is advised for those who are easily unsettled by the unexplained. The air in rural Maryland carries a specific weight, a humid, heavy scent of damp earth, old oak, and the salt of the Chesapeake Bay lingering in the distance. It is a land where history isn't just in the books, it's in the soil. For the Miller family, the Blackwood estate was supposed to be a fresh start, a gift of inheritance from a distant uncle. But as the iron gates creaked open, the rolling hills of the property didn't feel welcoming. They felt like they were closing in. Elias Miller, a man of steady nerves and deep-rooted faith, pulled the station wagon up the gravel path. Beside him, his wife Sarah looked at the towering colonial structure. Its white paint was peeling like sunburnt skin, and the windows looked like hollow eyes staring out at the Maryland wilderness. Their 6-year-old son, Toby, sat in the back, clutching his stuffed bear, unusually quiet. He hadn't spoken since they crossed the county line. The house sat on a rise, surrounded by ancient, gnarled trees that seemed to lean toward the roof, as if trying to reclaim the timber. As the family stepped out, the usual afternoon chorus of Maryland cicadas, usually a deafening roar in the summer heat, suddenly cut to a dead silence. It was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring, the kind that suggests the local wildlife is hiding from something. "It's just an old house, Sarah," Elias said, sensing her hesitation. He gripped the silver cross he always wore around his neck, a habit of comfort. "With a little paint and a lot of prayer, we'll make this a home. God provides. Remember." Sarah nodded, though her eyes remained fixed on the attic window, where she thought she saw a thin, dark curtain flutter, even though the air was perfectly still. They spent the first few hours unpacking. The interior of Blackwood was a labyrinth of dark mahogany and dusty velvet. Every footstep echoed through the halls like a heartbeat. Despite the summer heat, the air inside was strangely brisk, carrying the faint, metallic scent of old coins. Elias began the tradition of his household, walking from room to room, saying a quiet prayer of blessing, asking for peace and protection over his family. He felt a sense of duty to sanctify this space. However, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the Maryland sky in bruises of purple and deep orange, the atmosphere shifted. Toby had been playing in what was to be his new playroom, a sun-drenched corner of the second floor. Suddenly, a sharp, rhythmic thudding began. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't coming from the floor or the ceiling. It was coming from inside the wall behind the boy's toy box. Elias ran to the room, finding Toby standing perfectly still in the center of the floor. The boy wasn't crying. He was simply staring at the wall. The thumping stopped the moment Elias entered. "Toby, what was that?" his father asked, kneeling beside him. Toby pointed a small, trembling finger at the wood paneling. "The man in the wall says the prayers are too loud, Daddy. He says they make his ears bleed." A chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning raced down Elias's spine. He placed a hand on the wall, expecting to feel a loose pipe or a rhythmic vibration of a generator. Instead, the wood felt blisteringly hot, almost like it was feverish. He pulled his hand back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at Toby, then back at the wall, the silence of the house now feeling heavy and expectant. That night, Elias sat in the living room, his Bible open on his lap. He had always believed that faith was a shield, a light that could scatter any darkness. But as the floorboards upstairs began to creak under the weight of invisible footsteps, and the scent of damp earth began to fill the pristine living room. He felt a flicker of doubt. The house felt like it was breathing, and its breath was cold. We must respect the history of the ground we walk upon, for not every foundation is built on peace. Curiosity is a gift, but caution is the guardian of the soul. As Elias turned off the lamp, he heard a sound that made his blood freeze. From the vents, a soft, dry whisper drifted through the dark house. It didn't sound like a ghost. It sounded like the earth itself was speaking, and it wasn't speaking in a language Elias had ever heard in any church. The morning sun in Maryland usually arrives with a symphony. In the thick of summer, the trees should be vibrating with the rhythmic, buzzing drone of thousands of cicadas, a sound so constant it becomes the heartbeat of the countryside. But when Elias and Sarah Miller woke up on their first full day at Blackwood Estate, the air was unnervingly hollow. Not a single wing fluttered, not a single insect sang. The woods surrounding the house stood paralyzed, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for a predator to pass. Elias stood on the back porch, a mug of coffee steaming in his hand, looking out over the sprawling lawn that bled into the dense thicket of the Maryland woods. He noticed something peculiar near the edge of the tree line. A patch of black-eyed Susans, the state's vibrant yellow flower, had turned a charred, oily black overnight. It wasn't a natural wilt. It looked as though the life had been sucked out of them from the roots upward. He felt a prickle of unease, a sensation that the very ground beneath his boots was hostile. Inside, Sarah was trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. She was busy in the kitchen, but her movements were jerky. She kept glancing at the baby monitor she had set up in Toby's room, even though the boy was sitting right there at the breakfast table. Toby was pushing his cereal around his bowl, his eyes fixed on the shadows in the corner of the ceiling. "He's still there, Mommy," Toby whispered, his voice devoid of the usual childhood wonder. "He says the basement is thirsty." Sarah froze, a plate trembling in her hand. "Toby, honey, who is he? Is it a game you're playing?" She tried to keep her voice light, the way she had learned in her child psychology books, but her heart was racing. Toby didn't look at her. He just pointed toward the heavy, iron-bolted door that led to the cellar. "The man with the dry skin. He says he was here before the house. He says the house is just his clothes." Elias entered the kitchen just in time to hear the tail end of the conversation. He saw the terror in Sarah's eyes and stepped in, his voice firm but gentle. "That's enough imagination for one morning, sport. How about we go outside and explore the old barn?" He was trying to exert his role as the protector, the man of faith who wouldn't let shadows frighten his family. But as he spoke, he felt a sudden, sharp pressure in his chest, a weight that felt like an invisible hand pressing against his sternum, urging him to stop speaking. Despite his bravado, Elias knew something was wrong with the house's veins. He decided to investigate the plumbing and the structure, hoping to find a logical explanation for the heat in the walls and the thumping from the night before. He grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight and headed for the cellar door. The iron bolt was freezing to the touch, despite the humid Maryland morning. When he pulled it back, it made a screeching sound that echoed through the house like a dying animal. The basement of Blackwood Estate was not like a modern cellar. It was a cavern of rough-hewn stone and packed earth, smelling of ancient salt and rot. As Elias descended the wooden stairs, the beam of his flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing walls that seemed to be weeping. Thick, dark moisture seeped from between the stones. He followed the sound of a faint, rhythmic scratching to the far corner, where a small, arched crawlspace disappeared into the darkness beneath the main foundation. He knelt by the opening, shining his light inside. The air blowing out of the crawlspace was frigid, smelling of wet fur and copper. There, Etched into the dirt floor of the crawlspace were symbols. Not quite letters, but jagged, aggressive marks that seemed to vibrate under the light. They weren't made by a child. They were deep, deliberate gouges in the earth. As he stared, the scratching sound started again, coming from just beyond the reach of his light. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Elias recoiled, his heart hammering. He stood up quickly, his head spinning. He began to recite the 23rd Psalm under his breath. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." But as the words left his lips, he felt a terrifying sensation. His voice didn't echo. The cellar seemed to swallow the sound of his prayer instantly, leaving him in a vacuum of silence. It was as if his faith, usually his greatest weapon, was being muffled by the very weight of the stone walls. He scrambled back upstairs, slamming the cellar door and throwing the bolt. He stood in the kitchen, gasping for air, his face pale. Sarah ran to him, clutching his arm. "Elias? What is it? What did you see?" Elias looked at his wife, then at Toby, who was now smiling a small, sad smile. Elias realized that the thumping hadn't been pipes, and the heat hadn't been friction. The house wasn't just old. It was occupied by something that didn't care for the laws of man or the prayers of the faithful. A brave heart must be paired with an observant mind. To face a great darkness, one must first admit that the light is fading, for denial is the greatest crack through which a demon may enter. That afternoon, as the sun reached its zenith, the silence outside grew even heavier. Elias looked out the window and saw a circle of crows perched on the fence, all of them facing the house, perfectly still. They weren't looking for food. They were watching, and in the corner of his eye, Elias saw a shadow move in the reflection of the glass, a shadow that stood taller than any man, with limbs that moved like the branches of the dying trees outside. The Maryland humidity had a way of seeping through the thickest stone walls, but inside the Blackwood estate, the air felt different. It wasn't just damp. It was heavy, like the atmosphere at the bottom of a deep well. After the terrifying encounter in the cellar, Elias spent the morning pacing the hallways, his hand subconsciously rubbing the silver cross at his neck. He couldn't shake the feeling that the house was a puzzle with missing pieces, and that those pieces were hidden somewhere in the dark wood and peeling wallpaper. By noon, the house had grown unnervingly quiet again. Sarah was upstairs, trying to coax Toby into a nap, but the boy's laughter sounded hollow, echoing through the vents in a way that made Elias's skin crawl. Seeking a distraction from the oppressive silence, Elias found himself in the West Wing, a part of the house they hadn't yet fully explored. There, behind a pair of floor-to-ceiling velvet curtains that smelled of a century's worth of dust, he discovered the library. It was a sanctuary of rotting paper and leather. Shelves lined the walls, sagging under the weight of books that looked as though they hadn't been touched since the Civil War. The air here was still and carried the scent of dried tobacco and old ink. Elias pulled a heavy chair toward the center of the room, the legs screeching against the floorboards. As he did, a small leather-bound volume fell from a gap behind the main shelving unit, landing with a dull thud. The book was titled The Annals of the Blackwood Foundation, 1784. It wasn't a published book, but a handwritten journal. Elias opened it, his fingers tracing the elegant, spindly script. The writer was a man named Thomas Blackwood, the original patriarch of the estate. As Elias read, the sunlight filtering through the grime-streaked windows seemed to dim, casting long, distorted shadows across the pages. The journal didn't speak of farming or trade. It spoke of a negotiation. Blackwood wrote about how the settlers had found the land already occupied, not by people, but by a force of the soil that demanded a price for every acre cleared. The church provides for the soul, one entry read, but the soil demands for the body. We have made a pact with the unspoken. We shall build our house upon his breath, and in return the harvest shall never fail, so long as the blood remains within the walls. Elias felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a debt. The man in the wall Toby spoke of wasn't a ghost. It was the very thing the Blackwoods had invited in centuries ago. The journal detailed how the family had practiced the quietude, a ritual of silence and offerings to keep the entity beneath the basement satisfied. But the last entry, dated 1812, was scrawled in a frantic, illegible hand. The faith of the new world is too loud. He wakes. The bells of the chapel have offended the deep. He seeks a new vessel. Just as Elias reached the end of the page, the temperature in the library plummeted. His own breath hitched in his throat, appearing as a white mist in the air. The heavy oak door to the library slammed shut with a force that shook the entire wing. From the shadows between the bookshelves, a low, guttural vibration began to rise, a sound that felt like grinding stones. "Who's there?" Elias demanded, his voice cracking. He stood up, clutching the journal to his chest. He saw it then, a movement in the dust motes. The shadows weren't just being cast by the furniture. They were detaching themselves from the floor, swirling into a tall, spindly shape that mimicked a human form but lacked any human features. It stood in front of the door, blocking his exit. Elias held out his cross, his knuckles white. "In the name of the light, I command you to move," he shouted. But the shadow didn't flinch. Instead, it tilted its head, and Elias heard a voice. Not in his ears, but inside his skull. It sounded like the rustle of dead leaves. "Your prayers are smoke," the voice whispered. "This land was bought with a promise older than your book. The debt is due, Miller. Give us the boy." With a surge of adrenaline, Elias charged toward the door. The shadow vanished the moment he neared it, dissipating into a cloud of freezing soot. He fumbled with the handle, burst out into the hallway, and didn't stop running until he reached the bright, sunlit kitchen. He stood there, gasping, the ancient journal still gripped in his hand. He looked at the book, then at the stairs leading up to Toby's room, and realized that his faith alone might not be enough to fight a pact written in the very foundation of the earth. Knowledge can be a heavy burden, but ignorance is a far more dangerous path. To protect those we love, we must be brave enough to look into the darkness of the past, even when the truth threatens to consume us. Elias hid the journal in a kitchen drawer, his heart still racing. He couldn't tell Sarah yet. He didn't want to see the light of hope die in her eyes. But as he looked out the window, he noticed the crows were gone. In their place, the trees themselves seemed to have moved closer to the house during the hour he was in the library. The woods were encroaching, and the sun was already starting its slow descent. The Maryland twilight didn't fade so much as it bruised, turning the sky a deep, painful purple before collapsing into a pitch-black night. Inside the Blackwood estate, the air grew thick enough to taste, a mixture of ozone and ancient dust. Elias Miller had spent the late afternoon preparing. He had retrieved a bottle of blessed water from his travel kit and placed white candles in every corner of the living room. He believed in the power of the word, and he was determined to turn his home into a fortress of light. Sarah sat on the sofa, her arms wrapped tightly around Toby. The boy was eerily calm, his gaze fixed on the dark hallway that led toward the library. He wasn't blinking. Elias stood in the center of the room, the ancient journal he'd found earlier hidden away, replaced now by his well-worn Bible. "We aren't going to let this house intimidate us," Elias said, his voice echoing with a forced confidence. "Fear is just an invitation, and tonight, we are closing the door." As the clock struck 10, the temperature began its steady crawl downward. The windows rattled in their frames, though there was no wind outside to move them. Elias began the vigil. He moved from room to room, splashing holy water against the baseboards and reciting the 91st Psalm. You will not fear the terror of night, nor the arrow that flies by day. His voice was a steady drumbeat against the encroaching silence. For a moment, it felt as though the atmosphere was lifting, as if the shadows were receding into the corners. But the relief was short-lived. Just as Elias reached the threshold of the kitchen, the candles in the living room flickered and died simultaneously, not as if blown out, but as if the fire itself had been smothered by an invisible weight. The house plunged into a darkness so absolute that Elias couldn't even see his own hand in front of his face. From the walls, the thumping returned, but this time it was faster, more rhythmic, sounding like 1,000 frantic heartbeats drumming against the wood. Elias! Sarah's scream pierced the dark. Elias fumbled for his flashlight, his heart hammering in his throat. When the beam finally cut through the gloom, he saw Sarah standing in the center of the room, but Toby was gone from her side. The flashlight beam swept the floor, finding the boy standing by the cellar door. The heavy iron bolt, which Elias had personally locked, was now slid back. The door was hanging open, revealing a throat of darkness that seemed to lead into the very bowels of the earth. Elias ran to his son, grabbing him by the shoulders. Toby's skin was ice cold, and his eyes were rolled back, showing only the whites. He was whispering in a voice that sounded like shifting gravel. The water is salt and the book is paper. You bring a candle to a son, little man. He was here before the word was spoken. The boy's hand reached out and touched the cross around Elias's neck. To Elias's horror, the silver began to tarnish instantly, turning a dull, charred black as if it had been thrust into a forge. Desperate, Elias pulled Toby away from the cellar and began to pray louder, his voice cracking with a mixture of faith and mounting terror. He splashed the remaining holy water toward the open cellar door. But instead of the hiss of retreating evil, he heard a sound that broke his spirit. A low, mocking chuckle. The water didn't strike the floor. It suspended in mid-air for a second, turning into a dark, viscous oil before falling silently to the rug. The traditional symbols of his faith were being rejected, stripped of their power by a force that didn't recognize them. Sarah grabbed a heavy iron fire poker and stood beside her husband, her eyes fierce despite her trembling. "Leave him alone!" she cried out into the dark. "This is our home." The house responded with a violent shudder. A framed picture of the Miller family on the mantel shattered, the glass sprang across the floor. The shadows in the corner of the room began to stretch and warp, crawling along the ceiling like giant, spindly fingers, weaving a web of darkness that threatened to entomb them in the living room. Elias realized then that he was fighting a war with the wrong weapons. This wasn't a standard haunting, and this wasn't a demon that fled at the sight of a cross. This was something elemental, a pact tied to the very Maryland soil they stood upon. He gathered Sarah and Toby into a tight circle in the center of the room, abandoning the formal prayers and instead simply holding them, shielding their bodies with his own. He stopped reciting and started feeling, focusing all his love and will into a barrier of pure human intent. The activity didn't stop, but it changed. The violent shaking subsided into a low, constant vibration. The entities stayed in the shadows, watching them with 1,000 unseen eyes. The family sat there in the dark for hours, huddled together on the floor, listening to the house whisper and groan. They were safe for the moment, but the victory felt hollow. Elias looked at his blackened cross and realized that their presence in this house was a trespass, and the unspoken was only just beginning to show its strength. Faith is not merely in the objects we carry or the words we recite. It is the strength of the bond between us. When the symbols fail, only the truth of our love remains to light the way. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the windows, the shadows retreated. Toby woke up as if from a deep sleep, complaining of a dry throat and remembering nothing of the night. Elias stood up, his bones aching, and walked to the window. In the morning mist, he saw his reflection in the glass, but for a split second, the man looking back at him wasn't Elias. It was someone older, with hollow eyes and a mouth sewn shut with silver wire. Morning in rural Maryland usually feels like a promise of renewal, but at the Blackwood estate, the daylight felt like a thin, translucent veil stretched over an ancient wound. The sun rose behind a thick bank of gray clouds, casting a sickly, pale light over the overgrown gardens. Elias, Sarah, and Toby were physically exhausted, their eyes rimmed with the red fatigue of a night spent in terror. The house was quiet now, but it was a predatory silence, the kind of stillness a spider keeps while waiting for its web to vibrate. Sarah moved through the upstairs hallway like a ghost herself. She felt a strange, magnetic pull toward the master suite's dressing room, a small alcove lined with tarnished silver mirrors and cedar wardrobes. She needed to wash the scent of the cellar from her skin, that metallic, copper and rot smell that seemed to have clung to her hair. As she splashed cold water on her face in the porcelain basin, she avoided looking at the glass. She was afraid of what her own reflection might tell her about the state of her soul. When she finally looked up, the world tilted. The mirror in front of her didn't show the cluttered dressing room behind her. Instead, the reflection showed the room as it might have looked 2 centuries ago. Pristine, lit by flickering candlelight, with heavy velvet drapes that hadn't yet rotted away. And standing behind her reflection wasn't Elias. It was a woman in a high-collared black dress, her face a pale oval of grief, her eyes replaced by 2 shimmering dark stones. Sarah tried to scream, but the sound died in her throat, muffled by a sudden, localized vacuum of air. She turned around quickly, but the room behind her was empty, just the peeling wallpaper and the dust of the present day. When she looked back at the mirror, the woman in black was closer. The stranger reached out a hand, and Sarah watched in paralyzed horror as a pale, elongated finger pressed against the inside of the glass. The mirror didn't reflect Sarah's hand. It showed the woman's finger leaving a smudge of frost on the surface. "What do you want?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The woman in the mirror didn't speak with words. Instead, the glass began to ripple like the surface of a disturbed pond. The image of the woman began to distort, her skin stretching and darkening until it resembled the charred wood Elias had seen in the basement. Her jaw elongated, and her limbs grew spindly and jointed like a swamp spider's. This was the entity's true form, not a human ghost, but something that had merely been wearing human memories like a mask. The entity leaned forward, its face pressing against the glass until the mirror began to crack. Spiderweb fractures raced across the silvered surface. Sarah saw her own reflection splintering, her face divided into a dozen jagged pieces. In each shard, she saw a different version of her life. One where they never moved to Maryland, one where she was alone, and one, the most terrifying, where she was standing in the cellar, her eyes replaced by those same dark, shimmering stones. The room began to vibrate with a low, subsonic hum that made Sarah's teeth ache. The drawers of the vanity began to slide open and shut violently, spilling old hairpins and dried lavender onto the floor. "You are the vessel," a chorus of voices hissed from the glass. It wasn't the voice of one person, but the collective whisper of everyone who had ever died on Blackwood land. "The pact requires a mother. The soil requires a heart. Give us the boy, or give us yourself." With a final, shattering blow, the center mirror exploded outward. Shards of glass flew across the room, But they didn't fall to the floor. They suspended in the air, orbiting Sarah like a crown of knives. She felt a cold, oily presence brush against her cheek, a touch that felt like the underside of a leaf. In that moment of absolute terror, Sarah didn't reach for a prayer or a cross. She reached for the memory of Toby's birth, the raw, primal instinct of a mother's protection. She let out a guttural roar of defiance, a sound that came from her blood, not her breath. The glass shards dropped instantly, clattering harmlessly to the rug. The temperature in the room rushed back to normal, and the reflection in the remaining pieces of the mirror showed only Sarah, pale, shaken, but still herself. The entity had retreated, but the message was clear. It wasn't just haunting the house. It was hunting a replacement. It wanted to weave the Millers into the long, dark history of the estate, turning them into permanent residents of the shadow world. Our reflections show us more than just our faces. They show us our fears. To truly see ourselves, we must look past the image and find the strength that lies in the core of our being. For the shadows cannot claim what is truly whole. Sarah stumbled out of the dressing room and found Elias in the hallway. He looked at her face, at the small cut on her cheek where a piece of glass had grazed her, and he knew. They didn't need to speak. The unspoken was making its demands. But as they looked toward Toby's room, they saw the door was standing wide open. The boy's bed was empty, and a trail of small, muddy footprints led not toward the stairs, but straight toward the wall where the thumping had begun. The panic that sets into a parent's heart when their child is missing is a cold, paralyzing poison. In the quiet halls of the Blackwood estate, that panic was amplified by the knowledge that Toby hadn't just walked out the front door. He had been claimed by the house itself. Elias and Sarah stood in the doorway of Toby's room, staring at the small, muddy footprints. The mud was black and oily, smelling of the brackish marshes found deep in the Maryland wetlands, miles away from the property. The trail didn't lead to the stairs. Instead, it stopped abruptly at the wood-paneled wall where the thumping had first begun. Elias stepped forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He pressed his ear to the wood. At first, there was only the sound of his own blood rushing through his veins. But then he heard it. A soft, rhythmic breathing, as if the house itself had grown lungs. From behind the lath and plaster, a muffled sob echoed. It was Toby. "Toby, can you hear me?" Elias shouted, his fists pounding against the wall. He didn't wait for an answer. He grabbed a heavy bronze bookend from a nearby shelf and began to swing. The wood didn't splinter like dry oak. It peeled back like wet leather, revealing a cavity that shouldn't have existed. Behind the wall was a narrow, vertical shaft lined with thick, pulsing tree roots that had grown through the foundation, weaving themselves into the very structure of the house. Sarah grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the gap. The beam didn't hit a back wall. Instead, it revealed a descent into a part of the house that wasn't on any blueprint. A non-Euclidean space where the angles seemed to twist and turn in ways that made her stomach churn. "He's down there," she whispered, pointing the light at a scrap of Toby's pajama sleeve caught on a jagged root. Without a word, Elias squeezed into the narrow opening, Sarah following close behind, their fear for their son outweighing the terror of the unknown. As they descended, the air became thick and humid, smelling of stagnant water and old copper. The walls were no longer made of wood and plaster. They were composed of packed earth and ancient, calcified bone. This was the thin place mentioned in the journal, a portal where the veil between the world of the living and the primal spirits of the land was worn dangerously thin. They weren't in the basement anymore. They were inside the skin of the Maryland soil. The descent led them to the very bottom of the estate, far deeper than the cellar Elias had explored before. They stepped out into a massive underground chamber. The ceiling was supported by the massive, gnarled roots of the ancient oaks outside, glowing with a faint, sickly bioluminescence. In the center of the room sat a pile of old, rusted toys, carriages from the 1800s, wooden horses, and modern plastic trucks. And there, sitting in the middle of the debris, was Toby. He was sitting with his back to them, stacking smooth river stones into a small, jagged cairn. "Toby, thank God!" Sarah cried out, rushing toward him. But Elias caught her arm, pulling her back. "Wait," he cautioned, his eyes narrowing. He noticed that Toby's shadow on the wall didn't match his movements. While the boy was stacking stones, the shadow was standing tall, its long, spindly arms reaching out toward the ceiling. "Toby, look at me," Elias commanded, his voice trembling with a mix of authority and fear. The boy turned slowly. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide and vacant, reflecting the shimmering light of the roots. "The man says I have to finish the tower, Daddy," Toby said, his voice sounding like two voices speaking at once, one his own and one a dry, rasping hiss. "He says when the tower is finished, the house can finally go back into the ground. He says we're the last stones he needs." The ground beneath them began to heave, as if a great beast was stirring in its sleep. The walls of the chamber started to close in, the roots twisting and snapping like whipcord. Elias realized that the house wasn't just a building. It was a trap, a lure designed to bring blood into the walls, to feed the ancient entity that lived beneath the Maryland dirt. The pact wasn't a business deal. It was a cycle of consumption, and they were the next meal. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out the blackened silver cross. Felt cold, colder than the air around them. He didn't use it as a symbol of his church this time. He used it as a symbol of his will. He stepped between Toby and the towering shadow. "You can have the house," Elias roared, his voice filling the cavern. "You can have the land, but you cannot have my son." As he spoke, he thrust the cross into the dirt at his feet, anchoring his family with the sheer force of his love. The shadow shrieked, a sound like metal grinding on stone, and the bioluminescent light flared into a blinding white. The chamber shook violently, and for a moment the world seemed to turn inside out. When the light faded, the parents found themselves huddled together on the cold, damp floor of the ordinary basement. The hidden door in the wall was gone, replaced by solid, unmoving stone. Toby was in their arms, shivering and crying, his eyes finally back to their natural, bright blue. A parent's love is a shield that no ancient darkness can easily pierce. True bravery is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to walk into the belly of the beast to bring your loved ones back to the light. They were safe for the moment, but as they climbed the stairs back to the kitchen, Elias noticed something that made his heart sink. The kitchen clock was ticking, but the hands were moving backward. Outside, the Maryland sun was rising, but it was rising in the west. They had escaped the basement, but the house had changed the very nature of their reality. They weren't home yet, they were just in a different layer of the trap. The world outside the windows of Blackwood Estate was no longer the Maryland the Millers knew. The sky was a bruised, static gray, and the sun, pale and heatless, hung low in the western sky at an hour when it should have been climbing from the east. The trees didn't sway, they pulsed. Elias stood at the kitchen window, watching the shadows fall in the wrong direction. He realized they weren't just in a haunted house. They were trapped in a pocket of reality being digested by the entity. A sharp, rhythmic rapping at the heavy oak front door broke the oppressive silence. It wasn't the frantic scratching of the unspoken, but a deliberate, human knock. Elias rushed to the door, his hand trembling as he threw back the bolts. Standing on the porch was Father Brennan, a man whose face was a map of deep lines and hard-won wisdom. He had been Elias's mentor years ago in Baltimore, a man who had seen the darker corners of the world and come back with his faith intact. "Elias," Brennan said, his voice a gravelly comfort. He didn't ask how they were. One look at the distorted horizon told him everything. He carried a heavy leather bag and a silver-edged Bible that had been passed down through generations of his family. "I got your message before the lines went dead. Or rather, I felt the air change in the valley. The land here has a long memory, and it seems it's decided to stop forgetting." They sat in the living room, the air so cold their breath came in thick plumes. Brennan listened as Elias and Sarah described the cellar, the thin place, and the vanishing of Toby. The priest's expression grew grimmer with every word. He didn't reach for his holy water immediately. Instead, he walked to the center of the room and placed his hand on the floorboards. He closed his eyes, his lips moving in a silent prayer. After a moment, he recoiled as if he had touched a live wire. "This is not a demon of the pit, Elias," Brennan whispered, wiping soot from his palm. "This is something older. In the old country they called them genius loci, the spirit of the place. But this one has been twisted. It was fed by the Blackwood Pact for centuries, and now that the line of blood has been broken, it is starving. It doesn't want your souls. It wants your existence to fuel its own." Brennan decided they could wait no longer. He donned his purple stole and opened his Bible to the rites of exorcism. He began to chant, his voice rising in a powerful melodic command. "Exorcismus te, omnis immundus spiritus." As the Latin words filled the room, the house reacted with a violence they hadn't yet seen. The floorboards buckled, and the wallpaper began to peel back in long, wet strips, revealing the pulsing, black roots beneath. The conflict reached a fever pitch when Brennan raised his Bible toward the ceiling. "By the power of the Word, I command this house to release its grip." But as he spoke, the golden ink on the pages began to shimmer. Elias watched in horror as the printed words didn't just fade. They scrambled. The letters detached themselves from the paper like frightened ants, swirling into the air before dissolving into gray dust. Within seconds, the priest was holding a book of blank, white pages. Father Brennan staggered back, his face turning a ghostly pale. He looked down at the empty book, the foundation of his entire life's work erased in a heartbeat. The unspoken shrieked from the vents, a sound of triumphant, grinding stone. It wasn't just resisting the prayer. It was unmaking the prayer. It was proving that in this thin place, the rules of the modern world and the laws of the church held no more weight than a dead leaf in a storm. The priest dropped the Bible, his hands shaking. It's erasing the connection," he gasped. "It's cutting us off from everything. If the Word cannot exist here, then neither can we. We are being unwritten, Elias." Sarah grabbed Toby and pulled him close, seeing that the boy's reflection in a nearby silver tray was beginning to blur at the edges, becoming fuzzy and indistinct like an old photograph left in the rain. Brennan took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm despite the loss of his scriptures. He realized that the formal rituals were useless against a force that predated the languages they were written in. He looked at Elias, his eyes burning with a new, desperate resolve. "We cannot fight it with someone else's words anymore. We have to fight it with the raw truth of why we are here. The land doesn't understand Latin, but it understands the weight of a life. Tradition is a powerful guide, but when the world itself begins to unravel, we must find the strength within our own hearts. True faith is not found in the ink of a book, but in the courage to stand firm when the book goes blank." As the house settled into a heavy, expectant vibration, Father Brennan reached into his bag and pulled out a small, iron bell, old, rusted, and unadorned. If it wants to unmake us, he said grimly, then we must go to the place where the weaving began. We have to go back down. Not to the basement, but to the root. Just then, the front door, the only exit, didn't just lock. It vanished entirely, replaced by a solid wall of ancient, impenetrable oak. The walls of the Blackwood estate no longer resembled a house built by human hands. As Father Brennan, Elias, Sarah, and Toby moved toward the center of the structure, the wallpaper didn't just peel. It curled like scorched skin, revealing a skeleton of pulsing, blackened timber and thick, ropey vines. The air was no longer Maryland humidity. It was the stagnant, suffocating heat of a prehistoric swamp. They were walking through a digestive tract of history, moving deeper into the gullet of the land itself. Father Brennan led them with the small iron bell in one hand and a flickering lantern in the other. He didn't look at the blank pages of his Bible anymore. He looked at the floor, following the way the wood grain seemed to flow like a river toward the center of the house. This house was never meant to be a home, Brennan whispered, his voice echoing in the distorted hallway. It was built as a lid, a seal to hold down what the first Blackwoods couldn't kill, but were too greedy to leave behind. They reached the grand staircase, but instead of leading up to the bedrooms, the stairs now spiraled downward into an abyss that smelled of wet slate and very old bones. As they descended, the modern world vanished entirely. The flashlight beams caught glints of something embedded in the walls. Not stones, but arrowheads of obsidian and shards of pottery that predated the colonial era by 1,000 years. This was the thin place in its rawest form, a wound in the earth where the spirits of the Piscataway and the ancients had once held the world in balance before the pact disrupted the scales. At the bottom of the spiral, they entered a chamber that felt like the hollow of a massive, living tree. In the center stood the root, a singular, massive pillar of calcified wood that stretched from the deep earth to the very rafters of the house above. It was covered in carvings, but they weren't the symbols of the Blackwoods. They were older, jagged warnings depicting a great hunger that lived in the soil. The root was weeping a thick, amber-colored sap that pooled on the floor like spilled blood. "Look!" Sarah gasped, pointing the light at the base of the root. There, half submerged in the amber sap, were the remains of the original offerings. These weren't just coins or trinkets. They were the personal belongings of generations of people who had disappeared from the county over the centuries. A child's shoe from the 1920s, a silver locket from the Civil War, a modern cell phone, all being slowly absorbed into the wood. The house wasn't just haunting the Millers. It was adding them to its collection of fuel. The unspoken finally manifested not as a shadow, but as the root itself. The massive pillar began to groan, the wood twisting until a face began to form in the bark. A face with hollowed-out knots for eyes and a mouth that was a jagged rift. The entity didn't speak with a voice. It spoke through the vibrations in their very bones. It projected a memory into their minds. The original Thomas Blackwood standing on this very spot, making a deal to trade the breath of the land for a harvest that would never fail. He had promised that the voices of the newcomers would be given to the silence of the soil. The pact was a lie, Elias realized, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and clarity. Thomas Blackwood didn't just sell his soul. He sold the future of everyone who would ever live on this ground. He stole the silence of the ancients and tried to bury it under a house. As he spoke, the root shrieked, a sound of splintering timber that knocked them to their knees. The amber sap began to rise, flooding the chamber floor, reaching for their feet like sticky, grasping fingers. Father Brennan rang his iron bell, the sharp cling, cling, cling cutting through the supernatural roar. "The bell is iron, iron from the earth," he shouted. "It reminds the land of its own weight." Stay together. Do not let the memory of the house separate you. He realized that the only way to break the seal was to acknowledge the truth of the land's suffering. The demon wasn't an intruder. It was a consequence of human greed that had been festering in the dark for 300 years. Toby suddenly stepped forward, escaping his mother's grip. He didn't look afraid anymore. He walked to the edge of the rising sap and placed his small, warm hand directly onto the freezing, jagged bark of the root. "You're just lonely," the boy whispered. "You're just waiting for someone to tell the truth." The chamber went deathly silent. The screaming of the wood stopped. The entity's eyes in the bark focused entirely on the child, a flicker of something that might have been recognition passing through the ancient wood. The sap stopped rising, but the tension didn't break. The house began to groan again, but this time it wasn't a roar of anger. It was the sound of a structure about to collapse. The unspoken was demanding a final choice. To break the pact, someone had to stay behind to balance the scale. The entity wanted a witness, a permanent occupant to hold the memory of the land so it wouldn't have to hunt anymore. We are all caretakers of the history we inherit. To heal a wound in the earth, one must first be brave enough to touch it and acknowledge the pain of those who came before us, for silence is the soil in which curses grow. Elias looked at Sarah, then at Toby, then at the weary priest. He knew what the trial of wills would require. The house was starting to fold in on itself, the dimensions collapsing back into the Maryland countryside. They had found the root, but the exit was still a world away, and the price of the negotiation was finally being called due. The chamber at the heart of the root began to contract like a closing fist. The amber sap, thick and suffocating, reached their knees, anchoring the Miller family to the very foundation they sought to flee. Father Brennan's iron bell continued to ring, but the sound was becoming duller, as if the air itself was turning into lead. The unspoken was no longer just a face in the bark. It was the entire atmosphere, a crushing weight of 300 years of stolen voices and broken promises. "The house won't let us leave together," Father Brennan shouted over the roar of splintering wood. "It's a mathematical debt of the soul. The original pact was for blood within the walls, and the land does not know how to let go of a promise." He looked at the root, his face etched with a terrible realization. To save the future, the present had to offer a sacrifice, not of life but of presence. Someone had to stay to witness the unmaking of Blackwood. Elias stepped forward, his boots squelching in the ancient mire. He looked at Sarah, whose eyes were wide with a mix of terror and understanding. He looked at Toby, who still had his small hand pressed against the bark, a tiny light of innocence against the ancient dark. Elias realized that his faith wasn't a shield to hide behind, but a bridge to be crossed. He reached out and placed his hand over Toby's, feeling the freezing, vibrating pulse of the entity. "I am the head of this house," Elias declared, his voice dropping into a low, resonant tone that seemed to steady the tremors of the earth. "I took the deed. I brought my family here. The debt is mine to negotiate." As he spoke, the shadows in the room gathered around him, weaving into his clothes, turning his flannel shirt as gray as the Maryland mist. He wasn't dying. He was becoming part of the house's memory, a voluntary anchor to replace the involuntary victims of the past. Sarah grabbed his arm, her tears hot against his skin. "No, Elias. We leave together or not at all." But even as she spoke, the exit, a shimmering rift of the real Maryland woods, began to appear behind her. The house was opening a door, but it was a revolving door that only allowed 3 to pass for everyone that stayed. The trial of wills wasn't about strength. It was about the honesty of love. Could they love each other enough to let go? "Sarah, listen to me," Elias whispered, pulling her close for what felt like a final embrace. If I stay, the cycle breaks. The unspoken gets its witness, and the land gets its peace. If we all stay, we all become like the shadows in the library. Go. Take Toby. Take him back to the sun, back to the cicadas, back to where things grow and die in the light. He pressed his blackened silver cross into her hand, the metal now warm for the first time in days. Father Brennan took Toby's other hand, his own face a mask of sorrowful duty. He is right, Sarah. The land is satisfied by the truth. He is giving the house what it never had, a willing heart instead of a stolen one. With a violent heave, the root began to pull Elias toward its center. The amber sap rose to his waist, crystallizing into a translucent tomb. Elias didn't scream. He simply watched them, his expression one of profound, heartbreaking peace. In a final, desperate surge of will, Sarah and Toby were pushed toward the shimmering rift. The sounds of the house, the thumping, the whispering, the grinding of stone, reached a deafening crescendo, and then, with the sound of a single, snapped violin string, everything went silent. Sarah and Toby tumbled onto the damp, cool grass of the Maryland hillside. The sun was rising in the east. The cicadas were screaming their morning song. They turned around, gasping for air, expecting to see the towering colonial estate. But the Blackwood estate was gone. In its place stood only a field of blackened, charred timber and a single massive oak tree that looked as though it had been struck by lightning 100 years ago. There was no house, no cellar, and no Elias. Only the wind whistling through the hollow trunk of the tree remained, carrying a faint, familiar scent of old coins and tobacco. The greatest act of bravery is not in winning a fight, but in the willingness to sacrifice oneself for the safety of others. Love is the only currency that can truly settle an ancient debt, for it is the only thing the darkness cannot duplicate. Sarah clutched the blackened cross to her chest, her heart breaking in the morning light. Toby looked up at her, his eyes clear and bright. "Daddy's not gone, Mommy," the boy said softly, pointing to the great oak. "He's just making sure the tree stays quiet." As they walked toward their car, Sarah looked back one last time and saw a figure standing in the shade of the tree. A silhouette of a man watching over the land, ensuring that the unspoken would never speak again. The morning after the disappearance of the Blackwood estate, the Maryland sun felt strangely clinical. It illuminated the charred remains of the foundation and the singular, scorched oak tree with a harshness that left no room for shadows. Sarah and Toby sat in the car at the edge of the property, the engine idling. The silence of the countryside had returned, but it was no longer the predatory silence of the entity. It was the quiet of a graveyard after the mourners have left. Father Brennan stood by the blackened ruins, his hands folded. He looked older, his shoulders hunched as if he carried the weight of the house itself. He watched as the local authorities arrived, men in tan uniforms who looked at the empty field with confusion. There were no bodies, no signs of a fire, and no explanation for how a 3-story colonial mansion could vanish into the earth overnight. To the world, the Millers had suffered a tragedy they couldn't name. To the land, a balance had finally been restored. Sarah stepped out of the car, clutching the silver cross that had turned back to its original luster, though it felt heavier than it ever had before. She walked toward the great oak. As she approached, she noticed that the blackened grass around the trunk was already beginning to show tiny sprouts of vibrant, healthy green. The thin place was closing. The wound in the earth was knitting itself shut, using Elias's sacrifice as the thread. She placed her hand on the rough bark of the tree. For a fleeting second, she didn't feel cold wood. She felt a pulse. It was a steady, calm rhythm, like a heart at rest. She closed her eyes and heard a whisper on the wind. not the guttural hiss of the unspoken, but the warm, steady voice of her husband. "It is finished, Sarah. The debt is paid. Take the boy and live in the light. I will keep the watch." The moral of the Blackwood legacy was finally clear. The land we walk upon is not merely a resource. It is a living history. Every house is built on a foundation of those who came before, and when we move into new spaces, we must do so with respect, honesty, and a willingness to understand the past. The Millers had learned that faith is not a ritual performed to keep ghosts away. It is the courage to stand as a guardian for those who cannot protect themselves. Years later, the people of Prince George's County would tell stories of the vigilant oak. They said that no matter how harsh the Maryland winters were, the snow never settled on its branches. They said that if you stood near the tree during a summer storm, you would never feel a drop of rain. Most importantly, they said that the cicadas in that specific field sang a song that sounded like a hymn, a melody of protection that kept the deeper, darker things of the earth from ever rising again. Sarah and Toby eventually moved toward the coast, far from the heavy soil of the interior. But every year, on the anniversary of their escape, they would return to the field. They wouldn't bring candles or Bibles. They would simply bring a small river stone and place it at the base of the tree. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, a way of saying that while the house was gone, the man who saved them was still there, a silent sentinel in the heart of the Maryland woods. Moral lesson: the price of peace is often a burden carried by the few for the sake of the many. True bravery is found in the quiet, eternal commitment to protect the light, even if it means standing in the shadows to do so. Respect the land, for it remembers every step you take. As Sarah drove away for the final time, she looked in the rearview mirror. For a moment, she saw the silhouette of the house shimmering in the heat haze, a phantom of what once was. But then it faded, replaced by the sight of Toby in the back seat, his eyes bright and full of the future. The Blackwood curse was broken, and though the price was heavy, the world was a little brighter for the man who chose to stay behind.